Hello and welcome. I'm Alan Williamson, an associate with TSA. I'm going to be facilitating a short video for you today that will focus on how we can help ensure reliability in the digital future. I'm joined today by Steve Sadler, who leads on the technology strategy for TSA, and Tim Mulrey, who, as part of his role in strategy and transformation for the TSA, is assisting Steve with developing the TSA's technical guidance for members. Tim, I'm going to come to you first. You've been out meeting our members recently at our own TSA surgery events. To start off with today, can you give us some feedback from the surgeries, please?
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. So over the last 4 weeks, the TSA has conducted several member surgeries and across all regions in the UK to provide information and guidance, as well as to collate feedback on a number of hot topics. The analogue to digital transformation is currently the hottest of those hot topics. We were clear to our members that our role is to provide support and guidance as part of the TSA membership, to provide a greater level of assurance to our certified members as part of the quality standards framework, and to also offer our members specific hands-on support as part of our consultancy offer.
So Tim, on the hot topic of the digital shift, can you please summarise what's happening for us, but in layman's terms?
Yeah, sure. The analogue to digital transformation describes the process of how the main telecommunications providers are changing their core telephony network so that all telephone calls will be transmitted in digital rather than analogue format. This affects absolutely everyone in the UK, and although many people won't notice much difference in the quality of the call, they will need to make a change to the way that their landline telephone is connected to the network. Specifically, the telephone will need to be plugged into the back of the router rather than directly into the wall socket. The same also applies to any alarm or lifeline type equipment, where we'll no longer have access to the telephone networks based on PSTN, ISDN2 or ISDN30.
Thanks Tim, appreciate that. And welcome Steve. Steve, can you remind the viewers why the transformation is taking place and what are the timescales?
Yeah, sure. So what we're advised is the main reason for the set of changes on the networks is that the older core components of the networks are no longer maintainable. So the technology, the software, all needs upgrading, and there's a lack of resources and skill sets to do that. So what you're finding is all of the providers of the infrastructure are migrating pretty much together as a single plan referred to as all IP to shift across to those digital exchanges, which use packet switch networks rather than the traditional TDM networks. The latest dates we've heard for the conclusion of all those changes is 2025, which we're hearing from BT. But in reality, some of the communications providers have already started making those changes. So of course the key thing is that anyone offering services which rely upon remote telecommunications need to start to investigate the issues, start making plans to make sure they're not disadvantaged as things move forward.
Thank you. Tim and Steve, I've captured some of the key points that were raised at our recent member surgeries, so I'm going to put you on the spot now with a few questions. Tim, a big question that's being asked is whether services need to swap out their analogue alarms at a considerable cost.
Yeah, well, all of the advice from Ofcom and the telecommunications providers is that we should be using IP communication over the new IP networks, not the voice band alarm signalling that is currently in majority use today. So ultimately, the answer to that question is yes, equipment will need to be replaced. However, there's no evidence of any major government funding to address the issue as yet, and we just can't switch over services to around 2 million people, especially vulnerable people, overnight. So services will likely need to adopt a risk-based approach where equipment which is most at risk should be identified and replaced more quickly than the more up-to-date analogue-based equipment, where normal replacement cycles will in most cases address that risk over time. Having said that, a key part of assessing that risk is testing. So perhaps Steve, you can give us the latest on that?
Sure. So hopefully you'll have seen previous information from TSA and the work we've been doing within the technical advisory group, and we're trying to put together various guidance materials. You'll have seen one around the whole issue of IP and the move to digital infrastructure. We're working on a similar guide, which this time addresses particularly the testing of existing analogue communication alarm equipment over the new communication networks. So that's a piece of work that's in progress.
And when can we expect to see the testing?
So there's quite a big issue here. We really need commitment from the providers of the alarm technologies and the communications providers to get together to execute on that. The first step, of course, is to underpin that work with an agreed common test specification. We already have a draft, and that's been checked by NICC and Virgin Media and BT. But we finalise that, and that will be coming very shortly. Having gone through that process, we need to recognise that it's not that easy. What we mean by that is, if you think about this, you've got a piece of remote alarm technology connecting to a monitoring centre. It could be starting with one communication provider and finishing with another. And then you've got suppliers of different equipment for the device in the person's home and the alarm receiving centre. All those combinations need to be put together into a test script and executed upon. So the key thing is we need that test specification agreed very soon, and then what we absolutely do need is the commitment of the providers of the alarm equipment and the communications to coordinate, and we really need the alarm equipment providers to lead on that activity of testing for us.
Thank you. And Tim, I believe you also received some questions recently regarding the power and battery issues. Can you expand on this, please?
Yes, of course. Steve has just covered one of the biggest questions being asked relating to the reliability of alarm protocol exchange. Perhaps the other biggest headache is what alarms, or what happens to alarms in the event of power failure in the home. In the new digital world, any alarms connected to routers will lose connectivity to phone services where routers and other network equipment loses power. Ofcom is insisting that telecommunications providers ensure at least 1 hour battery backup for calls to 999 services when power fails, but this falls a long way short of the 24 hours required by social alarm standards. Also, the communications providers are adopting different solutions to this power problem, some of which only enable 999 calls and do not support alarm equipment. TSA's view is that we should not accept lower levels of reliability for alarm systems, and so we need alarm technology providers to deliver solutions which continue to comply with the alarm standards, EN 50134 in particular.
And Steve, surely the UK is not alone in facing these problems. What lessons are we taking from other countries that have gone through the transformation prior to ourselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we're looking at here, Alan, is the fact that it takes Sweden, which was very much the forerunner for this problem across the wider European region. What we found there, that they've had to tackle the issue in a different way. And interestingly, it circles back to the point that Tim raises about power outage and battery backup. So when you actually explore their large-scale migration, and they are virtually end-to-end digital these days, is the vast majority of what they've done is to switch from landline connections to cellular. And of course the basis for that was, firstly it's easier to deploy, but it avoids that issue around the landline battery backup issue. You can provide a 24-hour backed up cellular device. So that's led to a different solution.
And is it only in Sweden?
No, it's not. We're seeing similar moves at different rates all over Europe and the wider regions. So you already see, for example, in Germany and Switzerland, they're well developed. We hear that they're around about 80% migrated from analog connections to digital. And we're seeing similar programs running through Australia, New Zealand, France, and you'll hear more stories on those as they convert. I guess the key things to come out of those programs so far is that in all cases, you see the change being driven by the incumbent suppliers being unable to maintain the older infrastructure, much as we described earlier in the UK. But we also found that they're insisting that in most cases that there's no additional cost being passed on to the consumer, to the end user, which is wonderful but can be quite difficult to manage. And last but not least, the emphasis is on some sort of phased migration. This starts with a voluntary stage, but ultimately you have to mandate and force a changeover to make those networks shift digital.
Thanks, Dave. So the change to using mobile networks will presumably bring new challenges, with equipment needing SIM cards and new ways of connecting. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. There are lots more things to consider than when you have landlines, although fortunately the cellular networks themselves bring benefits in terms of robustness and encryption and so on. So I referred earlier to the technical advisory group's work in preparing guidelines, and we have one such guide also available now, which is around the issue of cellular or SIM connected devices. We don't have enough time here to talk through the key topics, but I would encourage members to download that or view that guide as soon as possible.
And Tim, so perhaps you could try to summarise, if I'm an alarm response centre or an organisation with responsibility for clients being monitored by an alarm response centre, what action should I be taking right now to minimise the risks of any failure or restrictions in alarm services?
Okay, well, from a TSA perspective, there's a current paper which has been submitted to the TSA programme board to request the merging of both technical and service groups. But there are a number of actions you should take as soon as possible. So, as Steve mentioned, read and understand the guidance that the TSA has produced for all members, and we will continue to produce that guidance. So we have digital readiness, mobile guidance, as well as all IP testing. Use the networking events that the TSA put together to link with colleagues and share information. The TSA plans to make available a space on the website for knowledge sharing and for frequently asked questions. In addition to that, understand your estate in terms of the equipment and network that it operates upon. What communication networks does to your alarm response hardware and software. What does it rely on? What landline technology do your clients use? Maybe you still have, or you have SIM card enabled equipment already. Check how reliability those mobiles, or that mobile network is how assured is that network. Some of this may be more challenging to find out, but it's worth really taking the time to understand your estate. The next point I would say is the testing specification. It will be agreed in the next few weeks. We're absolutely pushing on that. We will immediately insist on testing, and we will collate those test results and publish those test results to our members. Please encourage your suppliers to engage in this testing process. And finally, if you've not already done this, then please supply as much information as you can to the TSA All IP email inbox with regards to the numbers that your alarm equipment dials, as well as the numbers that the alarm calls are receiving in your alarm response centres. The reason for this, I'll give you a recent example. We recently discovered a partial outage of services in one of our accredited alarm response centres. This was due to a comms provider invoking best value call routing rather than best quality call routing. The result was that alarm calls that couldn't connect to the alarm response centre because of really poorer quality of the call routing and with multiple hops across the core network. Fine for a normal voice call, but not suitable for alarm protocols. This particular communication provider does maintain a lot of dialed numbers that require best quality routes to maintain the integrity, but the dialed numbers for that alarm response centre in question was not included in the database. And there are around 200 alarm response centres in the UK. It's vital, absolutely vital, they all have their dialed numbers registered with the various communication providers to maintain the integrity of those alarm calls.
So thanks Tim and thanks Steve, really appreciate your comments today, it's really interesting. There'll be more information provided to our members in due course, but please make sure that if you do have any questions or you require any information, please get in contact with the TSA via our dedicated email address, and Tim mentioned it earlier, so it's allip, ALLIP, at tsa-voice.org.uk. Thanks for listening today, and goodbye.
Right.